So glad you chose to spend your Sunday morning with us. If you're wondering why I'm wearing a mask, check your email. If you get our emails, if you don't, I'm just kidding. I was exposed to COVID. I don't have any symptoms, but I'm within a certain number of days supposed to wear a mask around other people. So trying to be respectful by doing this morning. This week began with me preparing to preach a sermon about Elijah, and we were going to talk about mental health, and then got towards the middle of the week, just didn't feel like that was the message that was for this week, and so I chose to make a switch and look at Joseph's life and a family that's really messy, but I do want to tell you something. We are going to come back and talk about mental health. Mental health is super important. I've seen a statistic that says 1 in 5 adults in our country suffer from a diagnosable mental health condition every year. So that means in a church like ours, there is a significant number of people who are suffering from mental health challenges. And I just want you to know you're not alone. You don't need to fight this alone. You can share that with the leadership here. You can share that in a small group. You can share that with others. You might be surprised what you find out. You might share it with someone and find out that they struggle with mental health challenges as well, and you guys can walk together on this road. But I do want to just say, if you need help, please get help. One of the first things we would recommend in most situations is to see a counselor. I have experience with Christian Counseling Associates of Columbia, Centerpoint Counseling, Safe Harbor. Those are all some good resources that you could look into to get you started. But please don't suffer alone, and if you need help, please get help. We're going to come back and talk about it, but I don't want to wait for that if you need help today. And so I wanted to start with that. But today, like I said, we're going to look at Joseph's story. We're still in Genesis. It's hard to get out of Genesis without continuing to look at messy families because it's full of them. We looked at Adam and Eve. We looked at Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. During the pandemic, we looked at Jacob's life, and now we're going to look at one of Jacob's sons named Joseph. Joseph is Jacob's 11th son, and this story shows us a great example of someone who suffered a great deal of hurt at the hands of his family, yet, by God's grace, is able to find healing. I chose this story because I want to convey this truth. The way things are is not necessarily the way they'll always be. Here's why. This is our main point. With God, there is hope for the messiest of families. With God, there's hope for the messiest of families. I figured in a series like this, you could leave here having listened to what we said. You could leave here agreeing, hey, most families have some level of dysfunctionality. They're messy, and God sees it, but we're just going to have to deal with it forever. It's never going to get better. There is no hope. I don't want you to leave this series believing that. I want you to leave this series believing that there is hope. Our Bible tells us that God can do more than we ask, think, or imagine. Apply that to your family. Maybe your family is going through something. Maybe it's been dealing with something. You may not even imagine what God wants to do in the situation. We're going to see in this message a period of over a decade where God brings about some changes in Joseph's family's life. We're going to talk about why the changes needed to happen, and then we're going to look at the process which God brought about the change. We find Joseph's story beginning in Genesis chapter 37. It goes all the way to Genesis chapter 50. That's too much to cover in a sermon, but we are going to paraphrase and get our way through most of that today. And so if you would turn to Genesis chapter 37. What you're going to find is that Joseph is born into a home where his father, Jacob, who also has a name Israel, he had 12 different sons with 4 different women. And first of all, that's messy. It would be messy to try to do that today, and it would be messy to deal with then. But we're going to pick up with that understanding in Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, and I'll read to verse 4. It says, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. he was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. See, it's interesting that we're told that it's not just that Jacob's children perceived a favoritism from their father, but he actually loved Joseph the most. Joseph is the second youngest. He's 17, and Jacob has a favorite wife, and then Joseph is a son of a favorite wife, and so it's real complicated. But notice what it said in verse 4. They hated Joseph and could not speak peacefully to him. The NIV says they couldn't speak a kind word to him. They had nothing good to say about Joseph. You say, well, why might that be the case? It's because their father loved him the most. And we're told something that he did that bothered them. In verse 2, it said, Joseph brought a bad report of his brothers to their father. Some scholars would say that the fact that Joseph gets this robe implies that, and it was fancy, you wouldn't want to get dirty, that Joseph was kind of just like the overseer. Even though he's young, his dad was just like, hey, you just watch them and tell me what they do. And so that's a really bad situation to be in as a sibling. But they're mad because he brings this bad report. You say, why did he bring a bad report? Because there was something bad to report. It's pretty simple, right? You know, you have more than one kid. One kid does something wrong. The other kid tells on the kid, and then the kid that gets told on is mad at the kid that told on them, even though the kid that did the thing is the reason that they had to tell on them. You know what I'm saying? It's complicated. But that's how it goes. I want you to notice that we're now looking at our third family in Genesis where the children do not get along. Think about it. Cain and Abel. We have also Jacob and Esau. We have Isaac and Ishmael, even though there's like age gap, they don't get along, is what the scripture tells us. And now all of these brothers. But what it seems like happened in the story is that Jacob did what the Apostle Paul tells fathers not to do. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, that Jacob provoked his children to anger by treating one son better than the rest. Fathers, it's important that we are considerate about what might provoke our children to anger and avoid doing those things. But I think it's also important to say this. Jacob's behavior does not excuse what we're going to see his brothers do to him. What Joseph's brothers do to him. Joseph's brothers convinced themselves that their hatred was justified because Joseph was dad's favorite, but hatred is not justifiable. It gets worse. Look at verse 5. It says, now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. If you keep reading, he actually had two dreams. The first dream, meaning of the dream, is that his brothers are going to bow down to him. The second dream is very similar, but it adds that his mother and father are going to bow down to him. And even his dad was like, what is going on? Like, I know you're my favorite, but this is a little bit much. Bowing down to you, your brother's bowing down to you, I'm going to bow down to you. And I think we need to acknowledge something about dreams, because today, if you have a dream, if your kid says, hey, I had this dream, you're like, hey, it was just a dream. Like, try to move on. But it is true in the Old Testament that God reveals things through dreams. There are even stories today of God revealing something in dreams. I'm not saying that you should assume that every time you have a dream, God's revealing himself to you in that way. I'm just saying that's what happened here. And it's what many claim to be happening today. But it's not Joseph's fault that his dad played favorites. It's not Joseph's fault that he had these dreams, but we're going to see in the verses that follow that his brothers respond in a way that is very wrong. It says, one day Joseph goes out to look for them, and in verses 18 to 28, we read this. It says, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into the pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand, to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, like it's no big deal. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? It's like, let's make some money. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Did you catch all that? That's a lot. They want to kill him. Reuben says, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. His plan is to rescue him. But then Judah steps in and has the idea to sell him to the Ishmaelites, so at least they profit off of this situation. What happens next, the Bible tells us, is that they take his coat, they kill a goat, they dip it in the blood, because this is not 2022 where you never get away with that, and they would test it and be like, that's animal blood, so something else happened. Now there's a case. We got to look into it. But in this situation, they tell their father that what happened, and he believes it. It's really like, when I read it, it's sickening, because it talks about the father weeping and wailing, and the son's coming in to comfort him, and it's just sick. It's like they know that this didn't actually happen, but they're telling their father this, letting him cry, and then just saying, oh, it'll be okay, Dad. We're so sorry. We're sad with you, even though they're not. Here's point number one. I want you to write this down. What happened to Joseph was unforgivable. What happened to Joseph was unforgivable. It's not like Joseph's brothers said something unkind to him and he should just get over it. It's not even that his brothers like stole his coat, right? That would be like a way less severe way to respond to this. They steal the coat and then they like go bury it in the ground so he'll never find it. All right, those are some like maybe more normal type of things that a sibling would do to one another. They are willing to kill him, and then they sell him into slavery. I can only imagine the thoughts that Joseph had while he was on his way to Egypt, the pain that he felt. But don't miss this. This easily could have been the end of the story. It could have just said, and Joseph went to Egypt, never to be heard of again, and the story could go on with the rest of the brothers. But that's not what happens. God did not abandon Joseph because of how his brothers treated him. I want you to look at what we find. If you turn, in my Bible, it's just a page, to Genesis chapter 39, verse 1 to 5. It says, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer over his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in this house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. The way things are is not necessarily the way things always will be. It goes on to tell us of how Joseph resist the advances of Potiphar's wife. That's a great sermon to be preached there about being a person of integrity, resisting temptation, all of that. But then she lies about him, and he ends up in jail. So talk about a roller coaster in his life. He goes from being dad's favorite, probably liked that, and then he gets sold into slavery, and then he finally gets back on his feet, starts to prosper in Egypt, and then he gets wrongfully imprisoned. Up and down and up and down. But what we find out is that while Joseph is in prison, he interprets some of the other prisoners' dreams, and word gets out. And one day, the greatest ruler of all the land, Pharaoh, has a dream, and he needs it interpreted, and no one is able to interpret it, but he finds out about a guy named Joseph. He has him, and Joseph comes, and he interprets the dream, and he tells him, hey, this dream that you had is very, very important to the future of the world. This dream is that there's going to be 7 years of prosperity. It's very easy in 7 years of prosperity to believe that that's all there ever is going to be. But the 7 years of prosperity is going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And if you don't prepare in the 7 years of prosperity for the 7 years of famine, everybody's going to die. So here's what you need to do. And he walks him through the process of how to help his people not just survive, but actually thrive. And Pharaoh likes this, and he puts them essentially over everything. So the strongest nation that existed at the time. And now Joseph is the second most powerful man in this nation. He's calling the shots. Genesis 41, verse 46 tells us that he's now 30 years old. The way things are is not necessarily the way they'll always be. Here's what this story is showing us, if you want to write this down. Point number 2, nothing is impossible with God. See, Joseph's story is a story about what God can do despite a messy family background, despite a messy family situation. It's about God, what we're going to see him delivering his people and helping them survive a famine that they really needed Egypt's help with to survive. But I have to tell you something. Even though Joseph had all this power, he had all the riches that he wanted. He had God blessing everything that he did. I believe, based on what we find next, that he still carried with him this pain of the past. This pain of being betrayed by his brothers. Getting sold into slavery by your brothers, 11 of them going along with it. Not a single one saying, no, we're not going to do this. It's not something you forget. Even after 13 years, because he was 17 and now he's 30. Joseph had to learn to live with his pain because he didn't have a choice. And I believe that he likely thought he would never see his brothers again. But again, the way things are is not necessarily the way they'll always be. You see, after these 7 years of prosperity, the famine comes over all the land, not just Egypt, including the land where Joseph's family lived. Genesis 42 tells us that Jacob hears that there is food in Egypt, and he says to his 10 sons, he says, I'm going to keep one back. You go and see if you can buy food so that we can survive this famine. Then in Genesis chapter 42, verse 6, we find this. Now Joseph, this point, was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from, he said. And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Now, can you imagine the emotions that Joseph felt at this point? Like the one we see is anger. I think he probably felt more than just anger. We see the anger because it says he spoke harshly to them. But they show up and they bow down. And Joseph, in the next verses tell us that Joseph remembers, hey, this is what my dream was when I was 17 years old. That my brothers were going to bow down before me. He says he accuses them, though, of being spies. And they tell him somewhat just out of the blue, they're like, hey, we have another living brother, which he already knew that. And he says, okay, leave one brother here. And he chooses Simeon. He binds him up, and he says, leave him here. You 10 go back, or what are we at now? Is that 10? You go back and bring, I guess 9. You 9 go back and bring the one that's missing, who just happens to be Joseph's full brother. All these other brothers are his half-brothers because they only have the same dad. But the one brother that's not there is his full brother. They have the same mom and dad. And we get some insight into what's going on in the minds of the brothers in verses 21 and 22. It says this, then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. Picture this. The brothers remember this picture of his brother being in distress and him begging them, and they did not listen. It says, and then, what does it say? And Reuben answered him, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. Joseph's brothers had not, and I don't believe they ever would have, forgotten what they did to their brother. They lived with the guilt of their actions all this time. It very likely caused them some issues. Very likely situations like this, if you've lived through anything like this, it's likely to cause you physiological issues where you go to the doctor and there are things that the doctor finds that are going on with you because of the guilt that you are living with. These are real things that have to be worked through. What we read next is that Joseph doesn't tell them who he is, but he sends them back with food and with the money that they brought. They don't know that he's sending them back with the money until they get back, and they're like, oh, man, there's this money here. We didn't mean to bring this back. How did that happen? Some time passes because he says you have to bring the one brother back, and Jacob's like, no, absolutely not. You're not bringing him back. Basically, it sounds like, well, this is my second favorite son, so we're definitely not losing him. And so there's all this conversation that goes on, and they say all this really, if you read it, it's really like, it makes me uncomfortable because the dads are like, well, if I don't bring him back, you can kill my son. This is all weird, crazy stuff. But eventually, they have to go because if they don't go, they're all going to die because they're out of food. And so they go, and then in chapter 43, verse 29 and 30, we read this. And he, that is Joseph, lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. They're telling you, this is his full brother. And said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. Here's the thing that makes family life so messy. Even though Joseph had been hurt, he may have tried to convince himself he's just going to write them off and doesn't care about them anymore. It's very, very difficult to actually live that reality. Joseph still loves his brothers. But it doesn't mean he trusts them. There's a difference. Doesn't mean he trusts them. There's a dilemma here. When you say, well, I just want everything to be okay, but I don't trust them. I don't want to just put myself in a situation to be hurt again. And so what Joseph does is actually something that maybe he thought about from the time that they left, and he's like, well, I'm gonna try to figure out if I can trust them. And so what he does is he puts them through a test. An entire chapter of the Bible is dedicated to a test that Joseph puts his brothers to see if he can trust them. I think about that, and I'm like, there are people's entire lives summed up in one verse. We get a whole chapter of the first book of the Bible dedicated to Joseph seeing if he can trust his brothers. Why is that? What are we supposed to learn from that? And before we try to answer that, let's just put out there, the test was this. He has a silver cup, and he plants it like he's a crooked cop, right? And he plants it on them, and then has them get caught, and basically is like, hey, you stole this. What do you have to say for yourself? And he's trying to see what they're going to say. He's trying to see how they're going to handle the situation. He's trying to see, hey, have they changed? Have they changed? They passed this test. But I think the thing we're supposed to learn here is this, from this entire chapter that's dedicated to this test, is that as much as Joseph wants to have a relationship with his brothers, they sold him into slavery. He has to see, hey, have they changed? Am I putting myself in a situation where this is just going to happen again, or are they different? See, when it comes to reconciling after serious offenses, it's wise to find out if the person has changed. Have they grown? Have they learned from their mistake? I don't recommend doing what Joseph did and planting something on someone. I don't know that God could have told Joseph to do that. Let's not pretend. That could have been a direct thing that God led him to do. The Bible is silent on where he got this idea from. But the test was passed by his brothers. And look at verse 45, verse 1 to 5. Remember I said that we see healing in this story? Listen for the healing. It says, and Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. He said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. You know, one of the things that often accompanies healing is tears. This is some ugly crying. This is crying that could be heard in the next neighborhood. Anybody ever cry like that? Like this? I can't even imagine that level of healing that's going on in Joseph's life right now. And I don't believe it's just because his brothers passed the test. Because you know what Joseph's saying in verse 5? He's saying, I forgive you. They were terrified. It says they were dismayed. The Bible uses that word a lot. Dismayed means stressed out. They're like, oh no. This is our brother? The second most powerful man in the entire world? Listen, you know what Joseph could do at this point? Joseph could do anything he wanted to them with no consequences. He could have had them tortured, had them sold into slavery, then tortured. He could have had them killed. He could have done whatever he wanted to them. He could have killed one at a time, could have cut off their toes one at a time, done whatever he wanted, tortured them, ruined them, made them wish they never heard him. But that's not what he wants. He doesn't want revenge, at least not at this point. He wants to tell them, I forgive you. Here's a definition I'll give you for forgiveness. Forgiveness is a process where I choose to begin to stop punishing someone and release them from the debt I feel that they owe me. I think you can see in some instances of what Joseph did that he was punishing his brothers. He was speaking to them harshly. He was sending them back and threatening, if you don't bring this one brother back, I'm going to kill the other one. He was punishing them. But at this point, he releases them from the debt that he feels like he was owed. I don't know that there's an example outside, we'll talk about, of Jesus Christ, where we see someone who has the power to exact revenge with no consequences, and then they choose to release it like this. This is the best story of forgiveness in the entire Bible, apart from the greatest story of forgiveness, which is Jesus Christ forgiving us. But you know something? He doesn't just release them. He releases himself. Lewis Smedes is a famous Christian author who wrote this. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. You catch that? To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. Forgiveness doesn't mean that what was done is okay. It doesn't mean things automatically go back to the way they were. Forgiveness is a process that ideally leads to reconciliation. In Joseph's case, his brothers showed him through this test that he concocted that they had changed. He believed it, so he's able to reconcile with them. That's not always the case. Had his brothers showed him something else, he may not have been able to reconcile with them in the way that he does. But he could have still done what some call and what Jesus describes as forgiving them in his heart. See, no matter what the other person is doing at the time that you realize you need to forgive them, that's where you start. You start with forgiving the person in your heart. You choose to stop dwelling on the incident. Stop planning how you're going to get revenge, how you're going to get back at the person, and you say, God, I release this to you. Depending on how serious the offense is, you might have to remind yourself of this day after day after day, and then maybe it'll lessen to every few days, then maybe weeks, then maybe it'll just come up every month or so, or you'll just remember it at random. Maybe something will trigger it, and you'll remember it, and you have to remind yourself, no, Lord, I have released this person. See, you know when you release the person, especially if you're back in relationship with them, and when something else is done wrong, you're not bringing up the thing that they did before. You know what I'm talking about? Well, the thing that they're doing right now is not really about the thing they're doing right now. It's about what they did before that you haven't really forgiven them for. It starts with choosing to stop dwelling on the incident. Here's our third point. Joseph is able to forgive his brothers because of what God shows him. Because of what God shows him. He says in chapter 45, verse 5, God sent me before you to preserve life. Boil it all down, Joseph, even at 17 years old, had this gift from God to be able to interpret dreams. Not just to have the dreams, but be able to interpret what they meant. God is going to give Pharaoh in Egypt, a different land, a dream that's going to tell him about the future of the world. The only person that can interpret this dream is Joseph. And so God works, and we say God works in mysterious ways. God works through Joseph's trauma to save his people, the Israelites. It's an amazing story. And you may never get this sort of insight into the suffering that you've experienced. I would even say it is not, I would not expect to get this sort of insight into your situation. Joseph, we're talking about 13 or more years later that it took. So first off, let's get that in our mind. It took a long time. But even if you wait 13 years, you still may not get that sort of insight into the suffering that you endured. But know this, God doesn't waste pain. And know this, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, God has shown you something that's meant to help you forgive others. And it's not just unique to you. It's something that's true of every follower of Jesus Christ. We find it in Colossians 3:13 and Ephesians 4:32. I'll read the latter. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. If we had more time, I would have us look at the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew chapter 18. It illustrates this point. I'm actually going to give that to you guys as a next step to look at because it really shows you this picture that we have been forgiven such a great debt by God. And it wasn't free for him to do that. He had to send Jesus Christ to the cross to suffer and die so that our sins can be forgiven. And for us to harbor unforgiveness is to disobey God. And not only that, I'm a Christian, many of you are Christians. Let's just take a step back and just Google effects of unforgiveness on your mental health. You don't need any, the first page of that on Google is not going to be any Christian articles. It's going to be Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, all these places like that saying, hey, it causes mental health challenges to refuse to forgive people. But here's the thing. How do you do it? How do you do it? That's where I believe Christianity has something that the rest of the world doesn't have. We forgive others because God has forgiven us a greater debt. See, this sermon didn't get into the ins and outs of forgiveness. I have preached sermons. I've preached a series in the past. It's probably still up on YouTube about with all the ins and the outs, trying to answer all the questions. This sermon is to encourage you that just because things are a certain way right now doesn't necessarily mean that's the way they're always going to be. I'm trying to encourage you that God can bring reconciliation. Look at this story. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and yet he's reconciling with them. And you'll see it goes on. And there's something interesting in Genesis chapter 50 if you want to read it. I cut it because of time, but I'm just going to say it anyways. Genesis chapter 50, his father dies, and the brothers are like, oh, man, Joseph's now going to kill us. And Joseph's just like, guys, I already forgave you. That's why I use Genesis 45, because he's like, what you meant for evil, it's a beautiful verse, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. It's hard even to be the one who did the wrong and be forgiven, to believe that you're actually forgiven, because you can't, some people would say, forgive yourself. You can't live with yourself because of what you did. But in this case, we see an example of someone, Joseph, lovingly reminding them when they come to him. They even lie to try to make him forgive them, but he's like, guys, I already told you chapter 45. Now we're in chapter 50. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And it says, and Joseph took care of his brothers. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story. If you're in a place where you're like, man, this all sounds good, I want to do what God wants me to do, I have some next steps for you. But as always, you got to scan the QR code before I share them. And so if you would, grab your phone. See if you can get this up. If you miss it, there's some of your seats have them on the side. You can get it. If you're new with us and you'd like to connect, if you just give us your mailing address, we'd love to mail you a free gift. If you give us your email address, we'll shoot you an email. But you can put interest on there, like baptism. Maybe you want to know about being a member of the church, serving opportunities, prayer requests. All that's available on there. But I'm going to give you some next steps. Next step A is the one I already shared with you. Meditate on Matthew 18:21 to 35. This is going to be what I give to the life groups. So if you're in a life group, you're going to get to do this. If you're not, you still should meditate on it, or you should join a life group and do it with the life group. They meet on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. If you go to our website, you can find them, and I'm sure they could get you in even tomorrow. But this will give you a picture of something that's beyond the simple few-word phrase, forgive others as God has forgiven you. It's a picture of what that actually looks like and what it means and how God views it. Next step B, start forgiving with the small debts. This is like maybe like a play off of Dave Ramsey's snowball effect of paying for your debts, but it's this idea that you probably, if you are not in the habit of forgiving regularly, you probably have a list of things that need to be forgiven if you were to sit down and think about it. It may be 10 things. It may be 1,000 things. Make that list. Some of them are going to be easy. Some of them, you look at it like, this doesn't really need to be forgiven. This needs to be overlooked. Right? The Bible talks about overlooking small offenses. You could overlook some of them. But the ones that need to be forgiven, you could start forgiving some of the easy ones and then work your way through the list. Help yourself see, right? Maybe take one a day, right? Help yourself see, hey, with God's strength, I can do this, right? There's some that you're really afraid of. Don't let the one you're really afraid of stop you from doing the rest. Build up that build up that courage and work your way down to the ones that are more difficult. Next step C, get a copy of Ken Sande's The Peacemaker. This phrase that I've been telling you about, choosing to stop dwelling on the incident, comes from this book. If you meet with me about a forgiveness issue, everything I say to you is going to come from the framework from this book. I've preached from this book. He gives a lot of practical help. All the questions that might be going through your head right now are answered in this book. It's a Christian book. It's fully rooted in Scripture. Talks about all kinds of conflict. But what he does is he breaks the process of forgiveness. I'm going to put this here if anybody wants to see it after. You can get it on Amazon. It's probably like $12. Or you can get it used like new, probably for like $9. That's what I do. But anyways, where was I? Breaks the process of forgiveness down to 4 promises. Choose, I will no longer dwell on this incident. That's just promise number 1. That one doesn't require the other person even to be alive, right? Let alone be alive and want to participate. The next 3 promises are working towards reconciliation, and they do require some involvement of the other person. But you can make that first promise. Choose to no longer dwell on the incident, no matter whether the person is still around, whether they have repented, anything like that. And so I put that before you if you want to explore that further. And then lastly, next step D, share a prayer request for next week's prayer service. Next week, we're doing wrapping up this series with a time of prayer. Like during the sermon time, there's going to be a short message, and then the rest of the time, so the majority of the time, is going to be spent praying for these messy situations. There will be elders on stage, and they're going to go through the different things we've talked about in prayer. So you don't have to do anything besides sit and listen to the prayers. But what we're going to have around the room is for the 4 things we've covered in this series, we're going to have butcher paper around the room, and we're going to have prayer requests. Any prayer requests that you all have, or I have, right, are going to be written on there. And you're free to write on them when you get here. So if you want to think about that, you're free to write on them during the prayer service. The idea is you can get up during the prayer time. For me, like, praying for 30 minutes is hard, to sit still and pray for 30 minutes and sit still. But I can get up and walk around the room and pray for 30 minutes. I could do that for 2 hours, right? Because I'm moving and it's guided and all that. And so there'll be stations around the room. If you don't want people to know that it's your prayer request, you can't write it on Sunday. That's obvious. So you can put it on your Connect card. You can email us. You can respond to the weekly email this week and let us know. If you want it to be shared and you want to send it in advance, you just don't want to write it, we'll write it for you. But if you want it to be anonymous, that's the only way to do that. And here's the thing about that. If you say, pray for my really messed up situation with my sibling, that prayer is no less effective if we don't know your name, because God knows your name. So if I was going to that thing, I would say, God, I pray for this person who's having a really messy situation with their sibling. That prayer just reaches God's ears, and He knows who those people are. He knows who you are, and so He will hear those prayers. So don't be like, well, is it good to be if you don't want people to know who it is, just give us an anonymous prayer request, and we would love to pray for you. But just remember, when you come here next week, it's going to be different. We want you to have prayer requests. And if you're here and you have no prayer requests, that's fine. Be one praying for the prayer request. And even if you have prayer requests, be one that prays for the prayer request, because we believe with God there is hope for even the messiest of families.